our objects as namespaces. And you may or may not have already been using namespaces if you're using any of the built-in Apex provided JavaScript. Just to give you an idea of what I mean by that, if you come to your browser, it is possible for you to go to apex.oracle.com/API, and this will take you to the PL SQL API documentation, to the most recent version. So we're going to get the Apex 20.1 version of the documentation, and the default landing page that you get here for this API is the PL SQL, and so we don't necessarily want only PL SQL. At the very bottom of this, you can see that we have our JavaScript APIs. So go ahead and select that. And the UI here is a little bit clunky because it's going to give me a link that then actually takes me to where I want to go. It's unfortunate, but it is what it is. And you can see here, there are several different namespaces that the Apex team has created to help organize the code that's available on the client side of your applications. I have an example here that's going to leverage the server namespace as well as the message namespace to communicate with the server to have it do something based on a client's action. And then I'm also going to communicate back to the user some response based on what we were able to do on the server. And I'm going to pick apart this example with you so you can kind of see how this came into existence. But first, I want to make sure that I clarify these two bullets. Here I have a bullet that says immediately invoked function expression, and then I say do not pollute the global namespace. What do those statements mean? Well, let me show you. Anywhere on any page I go, I can go ahead and press F12. And it will open the console so I can start playing with this page. I just happen to be on this Apex page. They have, oh yeah, they're using Hail Mary 2. All right, they got some interesting locked information here. Make this a little bit bigger so you can see. Every time you decide to make a variable, or I decide to make a variable, var my special var. Right, I have this variable. I can totally come here and I can assign it a value of 100. I can log that value out. It gives me 100. But anytime you make a variable, it has to be scoped to something. What this happens to be scoped to, the global scope, the top level scope, is the window. So if I say window dot my special var, it still returns a value. So basically what this is saying is that my variables have to be stored somewhere. And so they're going attached to the global scope if I didn't specify where they're going to be. Well, okay, that's fine. What's the problem? Well, if I'm declaring my variables this way and other utilities are declaring their variables this way, if I'm not careful, we could step on each other's toes. So if I'm generic enough and I say var number, right, it's possible someone else might also declare a variable number, in which case, if we use those code, if we use both that code in the same application, it's possible they could step on each other's toes and not really behave the way that we would expect. So how do we help protect ourselves from being able to associate everything that we write to the window? Well, the truth is, you can't completely escape associating values with the window. It's going to happen in at least once. So what if we tried to make it only happen one time? So what I could do, because we've been talking about objects, I could totally make an object called SB. Oh, an equal sign, that's kind of important. And now I have an object that's on the window, it's on the global scope, I have access to it. Everyone really has access to it. But when I have more detailed information that I want to store, I can scope it to my SB namespace. So what I mean by this, I could say SB dot my special var equals 100. It gets a value. I can still reference that value, but my special variable, my value that I'm assigning to this, is associated with the SB namespace or the SB object. It's not actually associated with the window. So it's a lot less likely, or it would be, I don't want to say impossible. You could deliberately shoot yourself in the foot, but in that case, you're not going to be able to avoid that. But we did scope our values to kind of be in a namespace that belongs to us. So let's look at a real example of how we might choose to do this in some ways that I like to kind of leverage this namespacing. Okay, so as I said, you can't avoid assigning a value to at least one value to the global scope. So you kind of got to own it. In this case, I'm going to create a new object called SB. I'm also going to say that I want to have a sub object associated with that called emputil. It's going to give me all sorts of utility functions to allow me to manage and work with employees. So what might some of these functions look like? The first thing that I want to point out is that I'm going to minimize this, and don't worry about this code down here. This kind of interesting syntax here is what is referred to as an immediately invoked function expression. And oftentimes I get the question, why'd you do that? It just looks like a whole bunch of noise. Why didn't you just write the code? And that's fair. The first thing that we have to understand is that JavaScript uses function scoping. So what that means is that if I declare a variable inside of this function, such as if I say var my special var equals 100, it is impossible outside the scope of this function. So if I minimize this and come down here, I do not have access to my special var out here. It is protected and completely hidden inside of this immediately invoked function expression. Oh, cool. So other developers can't really harass or impact the operation of this code. Go ahead and delete that for now. Don't need to hold on to that. The other thing that I can do, which I think is really cool, is notice that I have this function and I'm immediately invoking the function. And you can see there's this one-to-one mapping of there's the emputil that I'm providing as the first parameter, the Apex message namespace, which I am referring to or aliasing as message, and the Apex server namespace, which I am aliasing as server. And I guess the question is, why bother doing that when I could just refer to apex.message and apex.server in my code? Well, this concept is kind of referred to as dependency injection. We are injecting the dependency that we want to use in this scenario, and we're going to refer to it as server. So the advantage here is that, let's just say, for example, I decide that I want to make my own server namespace. So I come over here and I say sb.server equals object, and it's got all sorts of functionality baked into that. What I can do is I come here and I can say sb.server, and all of the code that I've written, assuming that this server is compliant to the Apex server implementation, assuming it has all the same functions and does all the same things, I could just easily swap those in and out. And one reason why you might do something like that is potentially for testing your code. Right? I don't want to go any further than that on that discussion, but that's why I am doing this. All right, so there we have apex.server and apex.message passed it as dependencies to my code. Notice that I have my emputil and I'm referencing some, I'm adding some functionality to this. I made my own notify function, and all it's doing is it's calling the Apex message namespace, and it's going to show page success. Showing page success just adds the little green notification to the upper right-hand corner and whatever message you supply it. So we're kind of making our own wrapper of how we want to notify. We're also, I kind of was lenient with this name. I made an oops function, which I can provide error message, and it will go ahead and clean up and display what Apex has defined as an message in the upper right corner. Again, you might be asking, why not just call these directly? Well, one thing that I like to do, I do this with PL SQL APIs, I do this with JavaScript APIs. I like to have some sort of intermediary between directly calling the Apex APIs for in the event that I want to change how exactly I notify the user or how exactly I show error messages. I can go to my function, change how that's supposed to happen, and that should be propagated all throughout my code. So I don't have to go kind of hunt down all the different lines of codes where I defined how error messages and success messages should be displayed. And so these are kind of more static method defined in my utility. Let's look at one that is a little bit more dynamic and interesting. So this last one that I'm going to look at here is called giveRaise. And this one's kind of interesting because it needs to interact with the user interface. Some information has to be provided, and the user has to click on a button or do something so that this code actually gets invoked. In order to properly give a raise, I need to provide the employee number, which I'm going to apply the raise to, and the amount in which that I want to give. Notice that I'm just calling Apex server.process, and I'm passing in a particular process name that I wish to invoke. I'm providing my values as x01 and x02. x01 and x02 are generic values that Apex makes available. This basically allows us to pass values to the server without having to define explicit items. Very helpful when you're just trying to make general generic utilities that should work in any, almost any application. So I wrote the code. Where do I put it? Well, let's go to my Apex application. Go to my page designer. I do not think my session has expired. Here in the function and global variable declarations, you can see that I've kind of copy and pasted that code here. Nothing special. It's just exactly at what we saw on the other screen. So I've defined this, and now I want to actually invoke it. How do I kind of connect this to my UI? Well, what's on my UI first? Let's just run the screen so we can see it. Okay, I have an employee number, and I have an amount, and I have a button here called Update Employee. Let's just run it so you can see what happens. I say Alan, and I want to give them an amount of $100, and I say Update Employee. You can see here that it says employee was updated. Woohoo! If I pass in some bogus information, that's not a number, and I say update employee, you can see it's just going to say unable to update employee. Very generic, but you could get more specific in the different error messages that you wish to provide back to your user. Okay, that's cool. How do we do that? Well, obviously, something's happening when I click on this button. And this is where I think Apex does, this is like the glue that I think you can use. You can use dynamic actions with your custom code. And this is where I think is like the sweet spot of writing JavaScript in Apex. You can still get your declarative binding to the UI, but all your complex logic you have in JavaScript files that you can version control and hold on to. Let me show you. Here I have my button, update employee, and there's a dynamic action defined. Super simple dynamic action on click of the button, update employee. Nothing fancy. But here's where we kind of integrate these two concepts or ideas. We have execute JavaScript code, and let's just look at this. Actually, okay, here's our code. Here you can see we're calling our namespace, SB, just short for skill builders, employee util, and then we can give raise. This will allow us to, we're taking the give raise function. We're passing along something that's specific about our page. Our page has an employee number item. We're getting the value of that. Our page has an amount item. We're getting the value of that. And after we're done invoking the give raise server process, when we're finally done with that, we're going to do something. Here, we have a response that we're going to handle. If the response is successful, then we're going to notify the message. If it's not successful, which means it failed in some way, well, then we're going to kind of provide an error message with whatever message was returned from the server. So the server is still in charge of what message we are going to provide to our user. I think that last piece of the puzzle is really important. How exactly are we going to return, how do we return this information back from the server? So before we look at the code, I want to show you something. If I open up my network monitor, and I close this, and I pass in 100, and I say update employee, notice that we have an Ajax request. It goes to the server, a response comes back. And I think it's really cool that you can actually click on this Ajax request, and I can go on response, and I can see it's really tiny. And can I make that bigger? It returns a JSON response with success true, and the message is employee updated. So all of this came back from the server. So if something failed, the server would let me know. Okay, well, how did I build that? Well, let's go look on the page. Go to my processing, and here is my Ajax callback called give raise. What exactly does this code look like? Open this up, and let me go ahead and make sure that I have this in Visual Studio Code. It's easier for us to look at. Oh, actually don't have it here. Let's go ahead and paste it here. And let me go ahead and change the language mode to PL SQL just so it looks a little bit better for us. Right. Remember, I was passing in the value x01 and x02. x01 was the employee number. x02 was the amount. You might be wondering why I'm assigning the values here in the begin and not assigning the values up here in the declare. The reason for that is because if, well, amount and empno are both numbers. And if I pass in something that's not a number, and I try to assign the value to either one of these, it's going to break. But what's really interesting is that it will not get caught by the exception handler. So my exception handling will work. So to get around that problem, what I do is I make sure that I declare my variables, because you have to, and then I just assign them when I'm inside the begin statement. That way, if there's something wrong, my exception handler will catch it and deal with it. Notice that I'm attempting to then update the employee. Assuming that this happens successfully, I'm then going to write a message using Apex JSON. And this is the last way in which we can use objects. Objects are a fantastic way for us to write messages back from the server. So in this case, I have a success key with a Boolean value of true. I also have a message key with a string value that is just explaining what just happened on the server. And in the event something goes wrong and things don't work out as we expected, I'm going to return success as false to say, that wasn't quite okay. Some sort of, in this case, just generic message just to say that, hey, that didn't work like we wanted to or we had hoped. And then I'm going to also kind of provide a dev message or some message that we can actually see what happened. And knowing that this dev message is here now, what I can do is if I go back, and I put in a funky value and say update employee, I get my unable to update. But if I look at my Ajax request and my response, I can see that my dev message is numeric or value error, character to number conversion error. And that's pretty obvious that amount was expecting a number and I did not give it a number. I gave it something else. So that is a practical example of how you can use an object as a namespace to do something, invoke it using dynamic actions, and that way you're kind of hiding the complexities in your own JavaScript objects. You can version control those or do whatever you'd like with those objects, but you're still getting the benefit of being able to create dynamic actions to associate all your hard work that you worked on to build those objects. All right. The last thing that I want to mention